All right, so we have been pretty steadily working our way through the chapters of the book of Daniel. Josh did quite a lot of chapter 9 last week. Grateful for that. I'm going to start with a fairly basic thesis this morning, and then we're going to get kind of deep into a passage that it means as much to me as anything else I've ever read. All right, and so I hope that you'll have some sense of why by the time that we get done here. The whole thing that Daniel's been saying and coming back to over and over again is that God speaks. Okay, God's not aloof. God's not unaware of the human situation. God is at work in human history, and he's revealing himself to the Jewish people. All right, and he is especially revealing himself to a specific subset of those Jewish people that we call the prophets. Okay, and so this is just the way that God has decided to make himself known. And it's through the ages of written history that he speaks his purpose into what is going to take place. And that way, we all know before things happen that they're actually God's intent. Okay, God has been planning this stuff all along. And so God could have chosen some other way to make himself known. It could have been some amazing experience for some specific people. You know, he could have done pretty much whatever he wanted. But what he has chosen instead of a subjective or a very individual track to reveal himself is to put an objective and public record out there. All right, it's information. It's information that we can like sit down and analyze, and we can study it together. We can ask questions. We can dig into it deeply, and we can just go at it until we can see clearly that there's just no other explanation for what we're confronted with than the, infinite and omniscient mind of God himself. All right, and so for a lot of us, this kind of thing is very important for a foundation for our faith. And so many people kind of weave in and out of having doubts. Okay, we just have questions that kind of come over us like a bad mood or whatever. All right, and we just can't shake the question of if there's really even a God, or how we would even know if there was really a God. And it's passages like this one, the 77's prophecy from Daniel 9, that we can go back to and just be confronted with this idea that, there is that. All right, how do you explain that? And so maybe this morning you're kind of at a place like that, even though maybe you've been a Christian for a while. You struggle to view God as super real, and you kind of wonder just where he even is. You have some doubts. Okay, that's totally normal. But God would like to come alongside you and appeal to what he's already written as a basis for you to understand that regardless of how you feel, and the highs and the lows that you experience, the things that God has spoken remain true. And so that is a foundation that you can build your faith on. And so maybe this morning you're nowhere near that place. All right, maybe you got drugged here by friends or family, and you don't have any questions about what you believe because you know that God is not a real factor. All right, if that's the case, then I would like to say that we're glad you're here, even if you're not. But I would also like to challenge you and encourage you to read along with this morning, all right? Get your calculator or your phone out or whatever. Check what we say here this morning and wonder if it's possible that God has, in some extraordinary way, drawn back the curtain and spoken with amazing clarity about things that he intends to accomplish in the world and therefore in your life. All right, and these are things that were accomplished hundreds of years after the predictions were made in order to demonstrate to you that the message of Jesus Christ is not some pie-in-the-sky dream. It's not a crutch for weak people. It's not some fairy tale for gullible people. Okay, it's a faith that's very uniquely rooted in fact. So think that through. All right, I have more than a few hours in studying this passage at this point, and I'm going to try and go through it as simply as I can. But understand that this is viewed by some as kind of complicated stuff. Okay, and one pass through it may not be enough for you to get your head around it. And so if it's confusing, raise your questions at the end. All right, I'll do the best that I can. It's important to me that all of us walk away this morning having understood what is being said. Okay, and so come to whatever conclusion you want to, but please try to understand what's being said. All right, so we're going to start by taking a look at it. This is Daniel 9, 24 through 27. We're going to do it verse by verse. It says, a period of 77s has been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the rebellion, to put an end to sin, to atone for guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. All right, so what's he talking about here? All right, this is a view that is looking toward the end of history. And he's saying that this is to confirm or to seal up the prophetic visions. And so all of the predictions about the Messiah from these Old Testament prophets must be fulfilled. And over the course of this study, we've already talked about this some, all right? We already know that prophets have spoken about where this anointed one is going to come from, all right? Micah 5:2 says that he'll come from Bethlehem. We know that he'll be born of a very young woman from Isaiah 7:14. We know what family lineage he will come from. He has to come from the line of David. Talked about that. Isaiah 9 told us that. We literally know scores of specific details about the person of the Messiah. Okay, we know who he is, where he's from, and what he'll do when he gets here. And now Daniel is saying that this message that he's receiving from God just puts the net around the whole thing. Okay, Daniel's being given a vision of what is essentially the culmination of all of human history. This is where God himself, through his anointed Messiah, is going to come and he's going to put an end to rebellion. All right, all the rebellion that has corrupted and destroyed the beauty of God's creation is going to come to an end. He's going to bring the guilty into accountability for the things that have been done. He's going to deliver from judgment those that have trusted in him. And he's going to establish his rule on the earth. All right, that's just what each one of these phrases means in this verse. All right, finish the rebellion. Okay, he's brought it to an end. He's allowed freedom to shake out, and human beings have been allowed to do what they want, but always within the limits that God has provided. And here, God is just going to put all that to an end and establish his everlasting and righteous rule. But the question that this passage really is getting to is this matter of when this is going to happen. When will God enter into history through his Messiah? All right. And right here, a perfectly clear answer to that question is given. It says a period of 77s has been decreed. All right, so that's about all there is to say about that. You know now exactly when Jesus is coming, right? No, of course not, right? Like the modern reader looks at this and doesn't know one single thing that they didn't already know. This doesn't tell you anything. Okay, so how long is a period of 77s? Well, I don't know. So maybe this is just like other religious writings or like Nostradamus, right? Where you just say a bunch of nonsense and then somebody decides that it means something later. Okay, and I think that we do have a tendency to think of all religious prophecy in just that way. Okay, but in the case of this biblical prophecy, the framework that you need to interpret the prophecy was like universally known by the original authors, and it was universally known by the people that they were writing to. And it can also be known by us. Okay, and so when Daniel says that this is going to go down after a period of 77s, he's actually saying something that's pretty clear. Okay, the word sevens is actually translated quite literally from the Hebrew. And this is where we get the word Sabbath. Okay, Sabbath literally means 7. Okay, but like 7 what? All right. And so we usually think of Sabbaths as referring to the Sabbath day. That's the 7th day, right? And so if I say that I will see you in 2 Sabbaths, then how many days are we talking about here, right? It's like 14, right? So you guys are totally with this so far. We can track with the math. But here's the thing. When Daniel talks about a period of 77s or 70 Sabbaths, he's likely not talking about Sabbath days, because the Old Testament also talks about Sabbath years. All right, and so that would be the 7th year. And so which one is the one that Daniel's talking about, and how can you know which one he's talking about? Well, I think that it's clear that the context here refers to Sabbath years, and that's going to be the time frame for the fulfillment of the great prediction. And so instead of me just saying that and you believing it, I think that we should demonstrate that. This is not really just what I think, okay? I didn't make this up. So this is Leviticus, which Moses wrote around 1400 BC. That's nearly 1,000 years before Daniel. This is what would be considered the law for the Hebrew people. It says, when you come into the land I will give you, then the land must have a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field and gather its crop. But during the 7th year the land must have a Sabbath rest. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard on the Sabbath year. So, the 7th year, the land lays fallow. And God's just saying that, that's the system that he wants. He wants the land to get some rest. And there's probably some really good agricultural reason for that. I don't really know. Okay, it doesn't matter to me. And even more important point is that this is the opportunity for Israel to place their trust in the God who provides. All right, they're supposed to be trusting that since God has said that they should let the land rest on the 7th year, then they're going to do that, and they're going to trust that what was produced on the 6th year would be enough to carry them through the 7th. Okay, so this is an opportunity for Israel to express concrete trust in God. Moses goes on, and he starts to let on that this is kind of a good news, bad news kind of thing. The good news was that if they obeyed the law, then God would bless them and protect them from their enemies. But if you disobey the law, then there are going to be consequences for that for the entire nation. And in that vein, he says, but if you do not obey me, then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation while you are in your enemy's land. It will observe the rest which it did not observe on your Sabbaths while you were living on it. So he's telling them that there is going to be a Sabbath rest for the land. All right, and whether they do it voluntarily or God does it for them, the land's going to get its rest. And so, the people in this room here right now are fairly familiar with Old Testament history. We know what mankind was like. We know the stories of the history of the people of God, and we know that they did not really get the job done here. And so in the late 600s BC, Jeremiah is writing, and he says, This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and you will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Okay, so he's talking here about the Babylonian conquest of the southern kingdom of Israel, all right, Judah, and this includes Jerusalem. And this is the whole context of the book of Daniel. And Daniel has been living in that Babylonian captivity. But the prophet before the captivity was Jeremiah, and he said that the captivity would come and that it would last for 70 years. And the reason that it would last for 70 years was really clear. All right, in 2 Chronicles, it says, those who escaped from the sword were carried away to Babylon and lived as servants until the rule of Persia. This fulfilled the word of the Lord through Jeremiah that the land would have its Sabbaths for 70 years. All right, so is it getting any more clear yet? Anybody know what we're talking about? He's saying that the people of Israel are going to be sent to Babylon for 70 years because 70 times they refused to give the land its rest, all right, on that Sabbath year. They're greedy, right? They didn't trust God. They realized that if they cultivated crops for that seventh year, that would be like a significant percentage more for them. And God is just like, yeah, well, do what you got to do, and then I'm going to do what I got to do. The land is going to get its rest. All right, so then Israel is booted out of the land for 70 years, which then means that this 70 years comes from the violation of that Sabbath year legislation over a 490-year period. You follow? Right? They're in exile for 70 years. That's 1 year for each time that they skipped a Sabbath year. And the Sabbath year only comes once every 7 years. So it's pretty basic arithmetic, 70 years of exile rooted in the 70 Sabbaths that were not observed, multiplied by the 7 years that it takes for a Sabbath year to come up, it equals 490 years. All right, so this is exactly the framework and the context that Daniel understands and that is in his mind as he's writing, and he talks about the 77s. Okay, so this prophecy is about the amazing hope that's found at the climax of human history. And this prophecy is also rooted in another 490-year period of time that's envisioned by God, but to an entirely different effect. Okay, and that effect is the culmination of all that God has been working toward and that he's accomplishing in human history. All right, so now this understanding of this 77s thing is essentially universal. All right, you may not understand it as a casual modern reader, but this is the way that the ancient Jewish people looked at this text. Okay, it's also the way that modern Jewish people look at this text. It's the way that ancient Christians looked at this text, and it's the way that contemporary Christian scholars view this text. So exactly what I'm describing this morning is universally understood to be the meaning of this passage. All right, there's this 490-year failure of Israel that results in 70 years of captivity. And now Daniel is envisioning that after a 490-year future, there will be a culmination of God's program on the earth. Okay, this is really not a matter of what your theological basis is. Okay, everyone agrees that this is basically what this says. If you don't believe me, check it out yourself. I'll help you find sources if you like. So he's given us something a little more specific. He's telling us that he's talking about when the Messiah will come. All right, and he says that after 7 Sabbath years and then another 62 Sabbath years. So you add those numbers together, you multiply times 7, you get 483 years. Everybody okay so far? So that's the number of years that's envisioned here from a command that was given, that was going to be given in the future to rebuild the city of Jerusalem until the Messiah comes. It's 483 years. That is 7 Sabbaths plus 62 Sabbaths, 49, plus 434 is 483. We're all good. We're going to come back to that, but we're going to push on for now. It says, after the period of 62 sevens, the anointed one will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing, and a ruler will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. The end will come with a flood, and war and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. So this is a broader picture of what happens when the Messiah comes. There are two things here that are predicted. One is that the Messiah will be killed, and it will seem like he hasn't accomplished anything. All right, and let's be perfectly clear here. The Bible predicts that the Messiah will come, but he will be killed. And the general verdict will be that he didn't really get anything done while he was here. Okay, it'll be a failed mission. That's one of the things that Daniel's saying in this passage. The second thing is that after the Messiah dies, a ruler will come and Jerusalem will be destroyed. And with it the temple that has not yet been rebuilt when Daniel is writing this. Okay, it's going to be wiped out. Daniel's predicting both of those things to happen at the end of this 483-year period. And so that's what people should be expecting. Going back to verse 25, if it's the case that from the issuing of this decree to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah comes is 483 years, then it would be very helpful to know when this decree was. Right? What's our starting point? When is the event that enables us to start the stopwatch to start counting this 483 years? All right, well, the scripture has a few options for us to consider, and specifically, there are 4 of these edicts that the Bible mentions. The first comes from Cyrus in 539 BC. Cyrus is a Persian that has destroyed the Babylonian army. He's taken over the Babylonian Empire. And one of the first things that Cyrus does is that he allows some of the Jewish people to return and settle in their homeland. All right, now, a bunch of Cyrus's administrators were very unhappy with this decision, and so they didn't let a bunch of the Jewish people leave. And so then, in 519 BC, Darius reissues the same decree. And then in 457 BC, Artaxerxes issues another decree that lets even more people return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. Okay, but there's really only one decree that history provides that really satisfies the specific conditions of Daniel's prophecy, and that is this second decree that Artaxerxes makes in 444 BC that's cited in Nehemiah chapter 2. All right, so let's look at that a second. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found your favor, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Let letters be given for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, and a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, to buy timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress and the walls for the city. The king granted this to me. And so the important thing about what's being described here is what differentiates it from the other decrees. Okay, it's not just permission to return to the land, it's permission to rebuild the defensive walls and make this a real autonomous city again. Okay, and that is exactly what's described in Daniel 9:25. All right, but these are things that are absent in all the other decrees to go back to the city. And so it makes the most sense that the beginning point for this 483 years until the Messiah shows up would begin in the spring of the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes. Well, I wonder when Artaxerxes began his reign. Well, it's the fall of 465 BC. And how could we possibly know that? Well, Wikipedia says so. Okay, this is common history at this point. This is undisputed historical fact. Okay, Artaxerxes took over the Persian Empire in 465 BC. And so the spring of his first year would be our 464 BC, and the spring of his 20th year would be 444 BC. All right, that's a pretty hard date. There's not that much to argue with up to this point. So now we have some math to do. It's pretty straightforward, not really any tricks. This is just a time frame. Okay, we have a place for the timeline to begin, and now it's just correctly doing the math. And you all are in luck. I'm a high school math teacher during the day. Okay? 69 sevens, or 69 Sabbath years, is a total of 483 years. We already discerned and explained that. And now if the beginning point of the issuing of the decree is 444 BC, and the amount of time from that point until the Messiah comes is 483 years, then that brings us to 39 AD. All right, so does 39 AD stand out to anyone as a year that something big happened? Me neither. So I'm not really sure what all was going on in 39 AD, but it doesn't sound at all familiar. We may need to look at this a little bit more closely and fine-tune things a little bit. And that's because in the writings of Daniel and in the ancient world in general, time was tracked by a lunar calendar, okay, or what is called regnal years. And so when they talk about things like the reign of kings, like in the book of Daniel, he doesn't say that he's writing in 539 BC. All right, why does he not tell us that that's the year that he's writing it? It's because there has been no Christ for him to be before, okay? That's what BC stands for, okay, before Christ. Our timeline has not yet been established. So he just says that he's writing in a given year of a certain king's reign. And that's exactly how the entirety of the ancient world functioned. Daniel's not being nebulous with the information. He's describing it as precisely as anyone could at the time. And so when the Romans wrote history, they did the exact same thing. All right, the third year of the reign of Tiberius. All right, or the second year of the reign of Herod, or whatever. Okay, they didn't have the timeline that we have today. It just didn't really exist. They used regnal years. They marked time relative to the dominant local power of their day. And it's also true that their year was a little bit different than ours. We've been through this with our festival calendar a couple of times. And so they tracked a year by tracking 12 30-day lunar cycles, okay, from a new moon to a new moon. And if you add up 12 30-day cycles, you get 360 days. So that's how long their year was. All right, but that meant that they were always off by a little bit for tracking with the seasons. And they would periodically add an extra month in so that it would match up with the seasons a little bit better, right? Similar to how we add a day in every 4 years to make up for the slop in our calendar. All right, so we need to really understand that when we're talking about hard dates in history, a modern historian is not using a lunar calendar and marking off years according to who the president is. All right, we're talking about specific dates on a timeline that we've extended backward into a history that didn't have the same timeline. And so when we brought up the date 444 BC earlier, we can correlate that date exactly through astrological things that have occurred, like comets and things like that have been recorded in ancient literature. And so in that way, historians can, with remarkable accuracy, fill out the entire timeline of the ancient world. All right, they set the hard dates and then they relate them to each other over our solar year. And you have sort of a complete picture of history that way. And so how many days are there in a solar year? Well, 365 is close enough. All right, so there's a 5-day difference between a solar and a lunar year. And that is why Chinese New Year and all of the Jewish holidays keep changing when they show up. All right, and so with this little bit of information, we can make our analysis of this prophecy a little bit more precise. The actual calculation of the number of days that this prophecy is talking about is like this. All right, there are 483 lunar years for the 69 Sabbath years, multiplied by the number of days in a lunar year, which is 360, that gives you 173,880 days. And then, in order to put that on the timeline that we have extended backward into history, we need to translate that into the solar years that the timeline is based on. We need to divide that number of days by the number of days in a solar year. So 173,880 divided by 365 changes the number of lunar years into 476 solar years. So the prophecy itself actually says that there will be 476 solar years from the time of the decree to the Messiah's big day. Okay, it's not magic. This is just a unit conversion, all right, from lunar to solar years. This is not any different from translating the language that this is written in. We're essentially translating the units of measurement. So this is how we mark historical chronology in the modern era. And so if we go back, and we know for sure that Artaxerxes' edict was given in 444 BC, and then we add 476 solar years that are those 69 Sabbath years from the prophecy. And then we land at 32 AD, which is actually pretty good. All right, but there's one more detail that we need to consider, and then we're done with the details of the math. We're looking at a number line. What's the difference between -1 and +1? It's 2, right? -1 to 0, and then 0 to +1. That equals 2. All right? But there's something a little bit strange about the way that historians map out history. There's no year 0. Okay, the timeline does not have a 0 on it. It goes from 1 BC to 1 AD. You're either born in the last year before Christ, or you were born in the first year of the Lord, Anno Domini. And so the difference in a timeline from -1 to +1 is 1. All right? Whereas on a number line, the difference is 2. So, since our little addition-subtraction exercise assumes a number line, we want to add another year to account for the fact that it's a timeline, not a number line. And that brings us to 33 AD. And it turns out that 33 AD is absolutely the best date for the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday and his subsequent crucifixion. And just to make sure that we're all with the program here, I want to step back a little bit. This is not smoke and mirrors. This is not some bizarre Christian interpretation of events. Okay? We have some other data from alternative historical sources to process. All right. F. Bruce is a British historian that has combed through both Jewish and Roman literature on the subject, and this is his conclusion. It says, we have to account for the widespread belief attested not only by Josephus, but also by Tacitus and Suetonius, that the sacred writings of the Jews pointed to the emerging of a world ruler from Judea at that very time. Josephus points out that Daniel, unlike other Hebrew prophets, was enabled to point to the time at which his predictions would be fulfilled. So the ancient Jewish people looked at Daniel with understanding, and they knew when it was pointing to. Okay, now they didn't have the 444 BC date in concrete like we do, and they didn't have a timeline like we do. They didn't quite have the precision that we have looking backwards, but they had a general idea of when the Messiah was coming, and it was in the 1st century. Okay, they believed and they wrote that God's Messiah was coming in their lifetimes based on this passage in Daniel. Okay, that's just a matter of historical fact. And so looking at this date of 33 AD for the crucifixion, you know, Jesus was, in fact, crucified under Pontius Pilate. All right, and that gives us a very, very narrow window for when that could have occurred. Okay, both Jewish and Roman sources back this up. On the Jewish side, you know, there's always Josephus, and he says that Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross. And the Romans have Tacitus, who writes, they got their name from Christ, who was executed by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. So these are solid 1st century historical documents that say the exact same thing that the Bible says. Okay, they're able to read and understand this prophecy to mean that the Messiah was coming in their lifetime in the 1st century. Okay, it's not just the Bible and the New Testament that say that this is the case. It's separate historians that are saying that this is what went down. Okay, and then there's the point of the ministry of Jesus. And according to Jesus, in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, he says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom. So that's the understanding that Jesus has of his purpose for coming. All right, he did come to earth, but he didn't come just to show us how to be nice and encourage us to be nice to one another. All right, all of the things that we've turned the message of Jesus into over the years sort of fall short if they do not have this point at the very top. Jesus came to buy you out of bondage. All right, human beings are alienated from God. We're not born into right relationship with God. We're born into a creation that is far from God and into a race of humans that's in rebellion from God. Okay, we all want to do our own thing and we want to go our own way. We all have our version of the American dream or whatever. Okay? And, you know, that's the God that we're naturally drawn to, and that's what we're really about. And the Bible says that that creates a barrier between the God that is your creator and you, who is his creation. All right? And that's a barrier that you can't work your way out of. You can't buy your way out of it. You can't perform your way out of it. Nothing you can do to get yourself out of the pit that you're in from the Bible's point of view. And so the good news, that's what gospel means, is that God has chosen to do for you what you couldn't do for yourself. Took upon himself the burden of your guilt and the death that we deserve so that we would not experience the judgment of God. And this is just exactly what the Old Testament prophet Isaiah said. As for my people, who considered he was taken out of the living for the sin of my people, to whom the stroke was due. So people looked around after Jesus died and wondered what it was that he had accomplished. Okay, it looked like nothing at all. And that's just what Daniel said people would see. It all looked like a failure. He came to earth. He got betrayed by his own guys. He was executed in the most heinous way possible. It sure doesn't look like a victory. And yet it was exactly the victory that God had planned. All right, it was through the death of Jesus that the entire issue of our standing before God has been completely dealt with. It's final. It's finished. Okay, and that is exactly the message that Jesus spoke. That's the message that Daniel's describing here. That's the message that Isaiah anticipated. Okay, that's what Christ came to do. Now in Luke 19, Jesus is working his way into Jerusalem. This is Palm Sunday. And he says, when Jesus approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known in this day the things which make for peace, the days will come on you when your enemies will surround you and hem you on every side. They will level you to the ground and your children within you. They will not leave one stone upon another because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. These words are coming out of Jesus' mouth in the month of Nisan, 476 years after the decree of Artaxerxes in 444 BC that set the clock ticking. To stop that clock would set off the reveal of God's Messiah, who would then be killed. All right? And of course, that's exactly what happens to Jesus 1 week after he says this. But also notice that Jesus says another thing. He said that the whole city would be destroyed. All right, Daniel said that too. The city will be destroyed after the Messiah is killed. And actually, in 70 AD, the Roman general Titus comes into the city of Jerusalem, killed huge numbers of Jewish people that are living in the city, and he tore down the city walls. He burnt the temple to the ground. He fulfills the rest of the prophecy that Daniel described and that Jesus warns about here. And so the entire picture that we have from history just perfectly lines up with the description that Daniel gives in the 500s BC. Okay, this whole thing is absolutely amazing. There we go. So let's draw some final conclusions, recap this just a little bit. First, Daniel's prophecy was written centuries before the time of Christ. All right, there is no legitimate debate on this point. We have physical evidence of Daniel's prophecy in the Dead Sea Scrolls with commentary on them in the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written before the time of Christ. I'm not making this up. All right, no one argues that they were written after Christ. All right, this wasn't written in after the fact. Secondly, the Jews were looking for their Messiah in the first century, based in a large part on this very passage from Daniel. I didn't make up the math, okay, or the interpretation of the math. It's the same math based on the same understanding of the time flow that led them to expect that the Messiah was due. Okay, there's no dispute on that either. The historical record shows that the Jewish people were expecting the Messiah in that generation. All right, third, Christ was crucified in 33 AD. Okay, and the city and the temple were destroyed in 70 AD, just as Daniel described. And there's not a legitimate way to say that those things didn't happen on very nearly those dates. Okay, and so that brings us to the real question. God's laid all this out for you. And God has spoken to the progress of human history. And God has spoken on what his intent for humanity is and how he will accomplish it through his Messiah. He doesn't want you guessing about what his intent is. And he doesn't want you wondering what it is that God wants from you. He laid it all out in specific detail. He came to take upon himself the burden of your sins so that you can stand before God as completely acceptable because of what he's done for you. Okay, that's the substitutionary death of Christ for you. That's the message of the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament. And in this text, in Daniel, he's telling us when that's going to happen hundreds of years before it happens. And it did happen just as he said it would. And only God could do that. Okay, that's God's case that he lays out for you. And now the responsibility is on you. Right? What are you going to do with that information? And let me suggest that you do come before God and express just how amazing this is, that God would outline what he's going to do hundreds of years before it happens, just so that you would know with some objectivity what God's intent toward you is. God has moved history in order to communicate to you because he loves you and because he wants relationship with you. You matter to him. And he's asking you to simply open your heart and receive the gift of forgiveness that he wants to give you. It comes with no strings attached, based on the complete work of Christ. And in that moment where you're able to say to God that this is what you want, then Jesus says that we have the right and the privilege to become children of God. Okay, we're brought right into his family. There's no more hostility. God's calling to you so that you will receive his forgiveness. It's what this is all about. This is why all this elaborate stuff is laid out there. He wants you to wrestle with this, think this through. And so maybe you're ready this morning. Maybe you're starting to sense that all this stuff just might be true. All right, well, we'll be praying in a few minutes. And while that's happening, I would encourage you to pray also. Okay, or look for somebody to help you pray. Accept God's gift to you and ask him to be an active part of your life. And maybe you're hearing things this morning that you've never really thought about before. You're just not sure what to think. You just need more information in order to think this through. Come see me. All right, there are many available books and people to talk to on this subject, and I will make sure that you get hooked up. Okay, there are many other avenues of evidence for you to explore, and you may want to look at some or all of them. All right, but wherever you are, I think it's very clear that you need to respond to what God is showing us here. This stuff is real. This is history. This stuff is fact, and you're being called from those facts into a relationship with God. All right. And so that's my take on the 77's prophecy. That's all I have for Daniel 9. If you